Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jane Eisner. I'm a journalist and author, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to a discussion about a really interesting and important new book, Tikun Ha'am, Repairing Our People, Israel and the Crisis of Liberal Judaism by Rabbi Jeff Salkin. We want to thank the Religion News Service for sponsoring this event. RNS is an independent, nonprofit source of global news about religion, spirituality, culture, and ethics, staffed by professional journalists. It was founded in 1934 and informs readers with objective reporting and insightful commentary, and is relied upon by readers, listeners, and viewers in the United States and around the world. This conversation among the three of us will also include a question and answer period at the end. So I invite the audience throughout to put your questions in the Q&A section of this webinar. We will be recording this session so that you'll be able to come back to it and share it widely, we hope. And we will be linking to books and resources, podcasts, columns, newsletters, and other materials that the group wants to share. The format today will be pretty simple. We'll be talking for about 45 minutes and then move to your questions. It's really a pleasure to be here with Rabbi Jeffrey Salkin, who's the author of the book that's the subject of our conversation. He also writes a column for RNS called Martini Judaism, for those who want to be shaken and stirred, which RNS publishes. And he is also now involved as a co-founder of Wisdom Without Walls, an online salon for Jewish ideas. Rabbi Michelle Dardashti joined Brooklyn's Kane Street Synagogue in 2023. She earlier served as an associate university chaplain for the Jewish community at Brown University and at Brown Hillel. She was ordained by the Jewish Theological Seminary and trained in congregation-based community organizing and clinical pastoral education. Dr. Yehuda Kurtzer is president of the Shalom Hartman Institute, a pioneering research and educational center for the leadership of the North American Jewish community, and he teaches on many of its platforms. He's also co-creator of the Hartman Institute's I Engage project, which seeks to build a bridge between Israel and world Jewry, and is the host of the Identity Crisis podcast, which can be found at identitycrisispod.com. So welcome to you all. Jeff, we want to start with you, since it's your book that has brought us together. The title of the book, Tikun Ha'am, Repairing Our People, is, to some degree, a takeoff on the more commonly known phrase of Tikun Olam, repairing the world. But you've chosen to really focus on this idea of repairing our people, the Jews, and that suggests to some degree that you think liberal Judaism is broken and needs repair. So tell us how and why that is the case.
Well, first, it's great to be here, especially with people who I've known for so long and people who I've with my colleague, Rabbi Michelle Dardashti, with you, Jane Eisner, and my friend and my teacher, Dr. Yehuda Kurtzer, whose work at the Shalom Hartman Institute has really shaped me. And in some ways, what I learned at Hartman over the years is in the background or the foreground of the work that I present. My publisher, Wicked Sun, decided to name the book Tikun Ha'am and not Tikun Olam, I think because they were being mischievous and provocative. They wanted to create a deliberate pun or a rhyme. Most American Jews know the term Tikkun Ha'am, to repair the world, and it has come to mean social justice, caring for the world, the greater society through specific policies and legislation, though originally it's a mystical term. Tikkun Ha'am is a newer term, and it means, yes, to repair our people. I believe that we in liberal Judaism need to readdress the balance between the particular, which is what I do for the Jewish people, and the universal, which is what I would do for all peoples. I think that is particularly true after October 7th. I have to say that the backstory of this book is that on October 6th, on that Friday, the book was ready to go to the printers. We went to sleep on October 6th in one Jewish world. We woke up on October 7th to another Jewish world. And by October 8th, I knew that I had to rewrite the introduction. So I got to use that great cliche, stop the presses, and all day on Sunday, I rewrote the introduction to talk about what it means to live in a post-October 7th world. I think one of the assumptions that we now have to, I think, interrogate is what we do about the universal, what we do about the particular. If I am only for myself, what am I? That is the universal. And if I'm not for myself, who will be for me? That's the particular. And I think we have to figure out how that mantra gets addressed. By the way, in my mischievous moments and my playful moments, I would actually say that those two phrases were uttered simultaneously. I would like it to be that way.
So in the book, you talk about Americanism being the first language of liberal Judaism, and that you wish Judaism would be the second language. That really intrigues me, that idea. And I'm just wondering what you mean and how that can be accomplished.
Well, I'll tell you, Jane, for me, the issue is simply this. We American Jews have been very good at speaking truth to power. That's the Tikun Ha'am piece, but we have not effectively yet, with certain exceptions, spoken truth to culture. And I really would like to see non-Orthodox Judaisms become a counterculture again. I think that we need to stand apart from some of the sociological and philosophical tendencies that are in our world. Now, what I mean by that is a culture that is overly reliant on consumerism. I define myself by what I have, and how consumerism, I think, has trickled into the Jewish community and into Jewish institutions. A culture of individualism, a culture of therapy that relies on feeling as the primary mode of being, and a worship of technology. So I think it's been very easy for the Orthodox through halakha and through their communal structures to stand apart from the world to various degrees. But I just want Jews do that as well, and use our institutions, use our language, use our texts as a way of saying that not everything flies, and we need to be loving dissenters within American culture.
But then that sort of relates to what you talked about moments ago, which is this balance between autonomy and community, and the universal in particular. So talk about that a little bit more. How do you strike the balance, or is it a dynamic exercise?
Well, it's interesting. I would like to fantasize about creating a T-shirt for Reform Jews that would say Reform Judaism, creating autonomous Jews since 1845. I think that autonomy for many non-Orthodox Jews has run out of steam. There was an old New Yorker cartoon from several years ago in which kids in a progressive nursery school are asking their teacher, do we still have to do what we want to do? And I think want and the have to, again, need to be balanced. Now, I'll be the first to admit, and anyone who knows me well knows that Jeff Salkin, even Rabbi Jeff Salkin, is a fully autonomous individual. But for me, I need a database of Judaism, Jewish ideas, Jewish texts, Jewish practices to balance that autonomy, lest it fritter itself away into chaos. Once again, it's about a balance. And I wish that we would bring these specific Jewish languages back into that conversation. I think that we need thicker community. I think we need thicker cultures. I think we need to see synagogues, JCCs, et cetera, as the proverbial third places. I think we need more Jewish Velcro.
So I'd like to open up the conversation now. Yehuda, you have spent a career really thinking about these issues as well from a somewhat of a different perspective, not necessarily a Reformed Jewish perspective, but to some degrees a pluralistic Jewish perspective. First, I'm just sort of wondering if you agree with the central premise. I mean, is American liberal Judaism broken?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me, and Mazel Tov, Jeff, on the book. It's good to be together with you all. Is it broken? I think the institutions, in many ways, of a liberal American Jewish life are broken. And I think a lot of the ideological suppositions that held in the middle of the 20th century that would kind of anchor American Judaism are really struggling. And a lot of that, I think, some of it has to do with what we have not done as Jews to reestablish the ideological foundations of what we're doing here. And some of it just happens to do with the fact that liberal American Judaism came of age as a result of a whole product of larger geopolitical and American circumstances that were good incubators for the Judaism that our parents and grandparents were creating, and the world has changed, and we haven't changed as much with it. So I think what I find with a lot of Jewish leaders is that we're constantly in this kind of place of whiplash. The trends around Jewish life, Jewish identity, the larger political circumstances around us move faster than our capacity as Jewish leaders is to re-articulate what it is that we're inheriting from the past and what we're changing. I think what I heard in what you said, Jeff, is when you talk about the language of counterculture, you're acknowledging that Judaism is always in a process of evolution and transmission, and you just sometimes feel as though it's frittering away as opposed to being continued more effectively into the future. And I guess the one place I would disagree a little bit with your characterization is Jews have always been assimilating to our cultural environments. In fact, that's the tool for Jewish survival, has actually been assimilation. What happens is, though, the person who's assimilating too much, slightly to my left, is an assimilationist, and the person who's not assimilating enough to my right is a fundamentalist. So we have to just get more precise as to, if we're all in this business of trying to kind of keep Judaism moving forward, what is it that like triggers your sense that I need to be countercultural, as opposed to where are the places where I'm actually allowed to be, you know, part of the assimilationist project that has been essential to kind of Jewish continuity and survival all along?
You
No,
know,
thank you.
I'm
So
really glad, I'm sorry. I'm glad shall I
please,
respond?
Jeff.
I'm really glad you asked that question, because I was struggling with that myself. And I was thinking back to, let's say, Maimonides, who imbued and imbibed the best of Judeo-Islamic
Mhm.
Spanish culture. I think that one of the differences is that in the past, unless I'm wrong, and you're a historian, Jews were tempted to buy into what you and I would call the high cultural moments of a civilization, the best of what the philosophy and what the community and what the environment could produce. And what I'm striking out against, I suppose, is I guess I'm an elitist or a snob, a kind of a middlebrow, lowbrow acceptance of some of the lesser manifestations of American society. When we talk about what's happening on the university campus, I think I'll be able to say more about that. Does that make sense to you?
So, but give us an example, like what's in that lesser category?
Well, let me give you an example. I know of some synagogues that have decided that they're going to now only have religious school twice a month. Notwithstanding the fact that when I was called in to consult with the synagogue that wanted to do that, I said there's absolutely no record anywhere of anyone devoting less time to something and having it mean as much. But that being said, when I asked why, they said, well, other synagogues are doing it and we have to be competitive with them. Now, that's a marketplace idea. Rather than starting from a place of principle, it's starting from a place of product. It's starting from what we can sell and what the consumers will buy. That's what troubles me. I wish that our institutions really had mission statements, they all do, by the way, and statements of principles by which they determine how it is they want to do their business. That's a piece of it, but I think that consumerism has just run rampant in American society, and it has, as I said, trickled down into Jewish institutions as well.
Mhm.
Second example was years ago when I interviewed for a position, someone said to me, Rabbi, you're going to have to compete with sports and people going to the sports games on Friday night. How do you intend to do that? And I thought of forgive me, I think it was Schleiermacher, religion and its cultured despisers. And now I'm thinking about religion and its uncultured despisers. I know how to compete with the opera and the theater. I just don't know how to compete with football.
Well, thank you. I want to bring Michelle in to this conversation in part because you bring many different perspectives, having been on a college campus, obviously, for many years, and I hope we'll get to that. But also because you are part of a non-Ashkenazic Jewish tradition here in America. Most of American Jews are Ashkenazic, that is, come from Central and Eastern Europe. But there are certainly in Israel an equal number of what we call Mizrahi Jews coming from Arab countries and from Persia. Your family, as I understand it, is Persian Jewish, bringing with them many different ideas, ideologies, rituals, attitudes. And in your book, Jeff, you actually posit that you think some of the seeds of renewal for Reform Judaism may in fact come from Mizrahi Judaism. So I'm wondering what you think about all that, Michelle.
Yeah. So again, I'll reiterate the gratitude and the Mazal Tovs for being here and being amongst friends and teachers. Hartman has also very much influenced me and my own work at Brown especially, but always. Indeed, I grew up in a home that was certainly not simply an Ashkenazi Jewish home. My mom is Ashkenaziya, however, so I am half Ashkenazi. But even on my mom's side, there's nothing mainstream American Judaism from a traditional Jewish synagogue perspective. My mom's not a challah baker, wasn't a synagogue goer. They weren't from the religious, as they would say. They were Arbeiter socialist, Zionist, folk singing. My mom went to high school performing arts. Her Judaism was through music, of music. And so when it came to religious Judaism, it was completely my father's side, completely from my Iranian family that I got it. However, my father became an Ashkenazi Chazan in the conservative movement. And if you want to hear more about that, you're going to have to listen to Nightingale of Iran. It's a podcast that my sisters actually are working on. I was going to work on it with them, but then I got this job and I couldn't. But everyone should listen to the Nightingale of Iran. Go to nightingaleofiran.com. But really, this week's episode that just dropped this Tuesday is all about that. It's actually called Ashken Normalization. And she speaks about how and why my sisters really are uncovering how and why it happened that an Ashkenazi boy from Tehran who grew up chanting services in the synagogues of Iran became a davener in Ashkenazi shuls. And one of the things that she doesn't say explicitly, I think, relates to the question that you're asking, which is the part that's not so weird about it, actually, is that there is something that conservative Judaism and Mizrahiyut share, which is that, I'm ordained in the conservative movement, is this balancing of whether you want to call it tradition and change, universalism and particularism, commitments on one hand to discipline and on the other hand to flexibility and ease. I don't think that conservative Judaism would talk about it that way in terms of flexibility and ease, but certainly when you talk about tradition and change, it has to do with what makes sense today in tension with and real conversation and indeed intentional tension with what the tradition has always said. So I actually think that it's not surprising that a lot of Persian Jews in particular, I'll speak to that rather than, Mizrahi Sfaradi more broadly, Jews have gravitated, that my father gravitated actually towards that movement, even though the particulars of how it happened are a much more interesting story. What I'll say is that I think that I became, first of all, it landed for me. I want to say to you, Jeff, your piece about Mizrahiyut, you talked a lot about how in non-Ashkenazi, I'll just say, whether it's Sephardi, Mizrahi, you talked about Persians in particular, a scene in a restaurant that I could definitely see, had a positive relationship to Judaism. And actually, I just spoke to a group this past week, and they talked about what animates your leadership. And I said, actually, cultivating positive Judaism. And I attribute that to the home in which I was raised, because I never heard, not only did I not hear the thou shalt nots, I don't think I even heard the word halacha.
Meaning Jewish law, which is what governs.
I didn't hear the word halacha. However, I didn't hear the word law ever. However, when it came to Jewish practice, however, there were very clear things we did and didn't do. I was raised in a home that had a thick spirit of the law practice. We had clear rules. We didn't use the phone on Shabbat for anything other than talking to family or friends. We didn't drive on Shabbat except for to shul or to meals for Shabbat. And that never became a slippery slope, actually. We could watch TV, but only something we were all watching together. And I really think it's because of that, I was raised with such a love for it, actually, and a love for how countercultural it was, quite frankly. Like, I went to a Solomon Schechter day school from 1st to 8th, but then I went to public high school where I really thrived, and I'm still in touch with all my friends from there. And they would come to my house for Shabbat dinner, and I was an ambassador, and it was so cool. I was president of my high school, and yet I disappeared on Friday nights. And that was cool. That was compelling to me. And it wasn't because of thou shalt not. And it wasn't because of halacha or lota says thou shalt not do. And I believe that I gravitated then even more so later in college and after to the letter of the law, right? To halacha or to mitzvot, commandments as commandments, mitzvah as commandment, because the spirit of the law had been so sweet for me growing up, that I wanted more of it. I wanted to thicken, right? As you say, I find halachic maximalism, let's say, compelling, not from a fundamentalist perspective, but from I love Judaism perspective. And when people ask me still to this day, so how'd you grow up? Did you grow up Shomer Shabbat? Are you more religious? How come you became more religious than your parents? I don't see myself as more religious than my parents or the family in which I was raised. I see myself as more halachically, legally observant, in a way that has enriched my own life. But I attribute that very much to the eclectic way in which I was raised and the very pluralistic way in which I was raised.
Well, thank you for that. That really helps us understand. I also think the diversity of a liberal American Judaism too. In one way or another, you've all alluded to education, and certainly knowing about Judaism, if only to make choices about then how to practice Judaism. And I'm wondering if we can talk a little bit more about that. Jeff, in the book, you really make a plea for Jewish education to foster peoplehood. Can you explain what that means and how you propose for that to happen?
Well, I think what happened that really made me realize this was hearing from colleagues on October 9th and October 10th, which is to say the Monday and the Tuesday after October 7th, that they were getting frantic texts from their congregants who had been getting frantic texts from their kids on the college campuses saying, I'm being called a colonialist baby killer and I don't know how to respond. And the parents were texting their rabbis looking for responses. And the rabbi said to me, some of them with just barely concealed snark, who told your kid to drop out of religious school after puberty? Now, I don't believe that the role of Jewish education is merely to create a focus on hasbara and on interpretation, public relations. I don't believe that kids should just be given talking points in the narrative, etc. But I do believe that a large piece of Jewish education should be an education for Jewish peoplehood, or Jewish civics education, as it were. And I've been saying this ever since Tikun Ha'am, Repairing Our People, came out in the synagogues that I've been visiting, which is to say that I think that we need to retool, certainly in Reform Judaism, Jewish education towards that sense that we are a small people, but we're a very large family. There has often been I think, tragic dichotomy between Judaism as religion and Judaism as people, ethnicity versus faith and spirituality. I want to bring those two together. But again, one of the things that I've learned in the courtyard of Hartman and in the Beit Midrash there over these summers is to see Judaism as a peoplehood-centered religious culture. And I think that has to be brought now into our institutions.
Yehuda, what do you think about that?
I want to go back. I want to answer that by going back to something to your, your critique of Jeff of twice a month Hebrew school. The reason why Jews went to shul in 1950s was not because synagogue in the 1950s was better. The reason Jews went to synagogue in the 1950s was because the only thing that would have been socially worse than being a Jew in America would have been to be an atheist. It was culturally normal for Christians to go to churches, and so Jews had to go to synagogue. And we know this. You watch the movie A Serious Man, which I think probably accurately depicts the morbidity of synagogue Judaism in the 1960s. It wasn't better then than it is now. I don't blame families for pulling out of congregational education. They're not doing so just because they are less interested in Judaism. They're doing so because we have not delivered a compelling product. It's like blaming the market, and it's blaming the market, and it's blaming the consumer. Mm-hmm. The thing that makes the better or worse American Judaism operate is that it operates in an American milieu, which is dominated by market capitalism. And we're going to have to basically decide whether our spiritual offerings, our moral offerings, the story of the Jewish people can actually compete intellectually, morally, and spiritually in that environment. Now, I think, both of you rabbis and you, Jane, and I, we live rich Jewish lives because we know we have alternatives, but we think our Judaism does compete. But I don't think, by and large, and I'm also not trying to blame the providers, I don't think we as a community are really investing anywhere near the resources in delivering a compelling product into a marketplace that's going to make people want to choose it. So until we know that Hebrew school education is so good that it's worth a kid giving up on soccer or drama to be there once a week, it's a much heavier responsibility on us as Jewish educators to do that work. And I'll just give you one crude example. I was recently at a synagogue doing an event. I was in dialogue with a rabbi. This was actually kind of a shocking moment. For a whole bunch of the event was scheduled, it was about Israel, October 7th, processing all that had happened. And they scheduled it the same night that they had like a teen program. So the teens were all there, which is great, by the way. They were there. They were kind of, I guess, against their will there, but they were there for the program. And at one point, one of the participants on the panel with me said, yeah, the real problem today is that, the kids these days, 17-year-olds, 18-year-olds, they don't understand nuance. And you have the teens in the room. And so basically they're being told, you're not smart enough to understand a serious Judaism. Look at us suffering as educators that we have to dumb things down for you. And the opposite is true. Our teens have more access to information and knowledge than any Jew in the history of Judaism. They are better consumers of a marketplace. We are the ones who are anxious about whether or not we can speak to them in ways that is going to make our claims compelling. So I'm totally with you on the main plot point, Jeff. Like, if we believe that there's something so interesting and sophisticated about Jewish life that it's worth being claimed by the next generation of Jews, we are way behind on turning that into something that the next generation of Jews is going to want to consume.
There's this Talmudic idea, the Tinok Shenishba, the infant who is taken captive and is raised in a culture and environment over which that infant has absolutely no control. In other words, this infant is without responsibility for what's happened. I think we've created this generation of the Tinok Shenishba. In other words, secularism and Americanism and consumer culture have so invested themselves in the way we live our lives, and that it's very hard to compete. I'm a little bit older than some of you. As a matter of fact, I will tell you something, Yehuda, about A Serious Man. That took place in the year of my bar mitzvah, and I actually figured out from the movie, the scene of the Torah reading, that bar mitzvah took place, are you ready? The Shabbat before the 6-day war.
Yeah,
I don't know if the Coen brothers knew this.
sure they did. I'm
But
sure
when I was growing up, we didn't have this stuff to compete with. If I was having trouble in math, which by the way, historically I did, I would stay after school for extra help. My parents didn't have tutors. I took piano lessons. I had a newspaper route. And that gave me days and nights to hang out in the synagogue and with youth group and stuff like that. I'm not being falsely nostalgic here,
you
but
are.
I guess I am. But I guess
Because you didn't have Netflix.
no, but what I'm saying is
That's right.
what I'm saying is that we didn't have Nebuch, we didn't have that much else going on in our lives.
Right.
I'm being sympathetic now to this generation. Overprogrammed.
Michelle, you have some thoughts about this?
I mean, I having been at Brown, it's actually what I loved about being on a college campus, which I loved the challenge of it. I loved, I chose at the time I was working at B'nai Jeshurun. I was their Marshall T. Meyer fellow, and I was then a job. So actually, it was another shul after that, and I was trying to decide, do I go to a shul or what? And I interviewed at Brown and found it so compelling, the idea that no one was going to come unless what I had to offer was exciting to them. Like that no one was going to come. There was like no fee for service. There weren't like Hillel members, and there weren't life cycle events they needed to come for. I found that exciting, and I find it exciting today too. Being in Brooklyn, it's one of the things I like about Brooklyn, right? I actually said in my interview, if what we're doing in shul is less compelling than what's happening on the yoga mat, like than what you're going to get on your yoga mat, then like you're not going to get off the yoga mat to come to shul. And I think that's legit. And I think that we need to both meet people where they are, but it's also about encouraging them to see it as a discipline that's meaningful, right? Part of what people love about yoga, right, or part of what there's a zillion different diets, but kashrut can't compete. Right? Like, I mean, it has to have meaning, though. It has to actually, bring mindfulness or meaning or uplift your life in some way. But you were also trying to edge in a question about peoplehood. And I'm not sure what your question was there, but I definitely think that for American Judaism, understanding that we're not it, that we're part of a global Jewish family, is a hugely compelling aspect of what will make Judaism thicker for people. It certainly was for me. So whether you call it peoplehood or global Jewish community, it's just like American Judaism in a vacuum is not Judaism. And I think that's important and powerful.
So you mentioned about being on college campuses, and certainly it's been trying to be on a campus after October 7th. And I'm just sort of wondering, Jeff, you hint at this some in your book. Obviously, there was only so much you could address given your publication schedule, as you explained to us. But I'm wondering what you might say to Jews who feel not every Jew on a college campus right now feels totally discriminated against and under siege. But certainly, I think there's a lot of loneliness there. And I'm wondering what you would say to those students.
I said to somebody, did you ever think that October 7th would provoke a full-blown culture war in America about the meaning of higher education? And I think that's essentially what has happened. I'm glad that not every Jewish student feels themselves to be under siege. I wouldn't want that. But I do think there are some very positive things that need to come out of this. First of all, I think that we have to, all across the board in American Judaism, understand that we are in deep pain, and we are all, I think, suffering to some extent or another from PTSD. Certainly our friends, our relatives in Israel are. But the crisis narrative is not going to sustain American Judaism long into the future. We have to create over and over again a positive Judaism that is built on community, is built on service, is built on study, is built on shared values. And so what I would say to Jewish college students is you have to seek each other out. You have to seek out the opportunities for community and for Jewish joy. I would also say something else. And I think I'm echoing what Yehuda said in a podcast a number of weeks ago. Yehuda, I hope I've interpreted you correctly in this. There's a difference between intellectual discourse and hatred. We want our young people to be intellectually challenged. And so let me go out on a limb here. If you want to critique Zionism, as you would critique any kind of nationalism, well, that's fair game. When it becomes hatred and becomes threatening, then it becomes a problem. In other words, let's not mistake intellectual challenge for physical or existential threat. I also would say the following. I cannot believe that for one moment, American Jewish parents, having fought their way into the upper echelons of American society, will turn around and say to their young people, you're not going to go to Harvard, you're not going to go to Penn. But I think when choosing a college, and I'd love to hear what Rabbi Dardashti is saying here, I think it's more than fair to take into consideration the climate at any particular college campus. Finally, I think it may begin as anti-Israelism. It may begin as a critique of 1967, but soon it becomes a critique of 1948, the creation of the state. And as I write in the book, anti-Semitism is not a critique of 1948 of the Common Era. Anti-Semitism is actually a critique of 1948 before the Common Era, which is roughly when Abraham and Sarah left Ur. In other words, if they had only just stayed there, life would have been much better. I think it's very important to see how much of this stuff reflects a current virus mutation of anti-Semitism. That being said, I want Jewish college kids to feel the joy and the love of being Jewish and not simply respond to the perceived hatred that's on the outside.
Do you have thoughts, Michelle, on this?
Yeah, about 9 years worth. I mean, I think as Yehuda well knows, work around Israel and anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism and defining terms, and helping students to create relationships across divides that were productive, not just for kumbaya, but actually for their activism, was a huge focus of the work that I did at Brown. And I think that someone at RNS put a link in the chat before to some of that work, which you can find at narrowbridgeproject.org. But I guess what I would say is, the work that I did was rooted in a deep belief that the kind of education that we need right now to heal the Jewish people, which is also something that's a balm for healing the polarization in this country among the Jews, is through relationships. That education needs to happen through relationships, and that nuance, the kind of nuance that you were talking about, that you were arguing whether or not there's more or less of today, is really obtained through relationship, by knowing each other. And it's deep and hard. One of the things that I was most committed to, the work was based on, was helping students uncover one another's blind spots. The need for all of us to help each other find each other's blind spots. People would say to me, how did you get anti-Zionists and Zionists to the table together? Why? And I said, well, first of all, I had a compelling values proposition. I said to them, you over there who think the most important thing is ending the occupation, and you over there, Jews, right, who think the most important thing is Jewish safety and security, right? Both of those things, first of all, are true. But I'm curious, those of you over here who are digging in your heels only on that issue, how's it going for you? And those of you over here who are digging in your heels on just that issue, how's that going for you? And then actually you'll be more productive, more intelligent, more empathetic, and nuanced activists if you're more relational activists and you understand each other better. And that was a compelling enough values proposition that people actually wanted to come together. And I think so much of the work, and the reason that the project was called Narrow Bridge Project, so much of the polarization in contemporary culture generally, and certainly in the Jewish community, is rooted in fear, right? And anti-Semitism is both a manifestation of fear, right, and what we're most afraid of as Jews, being hated. So a lot of our work was around, can we agree to some definitions of anti-Semitism? I think that is so much a part of what is tearing campuses and Jewish community apart at the root of it. And I was very adamant that we can't be talking about our definition. We can't be talking about Zionism and anti-Zionism and Israel-Palestine without agreeing to some definitions. And that agreeing to definitions around these things and around anti-Semitism is the work, actually, of Tikun Ha'am, of Tikkun the conversation, to some extent, right? Not. And then it wasn't, and I took a lot of this actually from learning with Yehuda and from learning with Hartman. The work that I did actually with Narrow Bridge Project was an adaptation of Hartman curricula that actually weren't as useful for them, for the iEngage curriculum. It was a curriculum that they didn't use as much, but I found super useful in my context, and that I was very lucky to be able to manipulate and use there. But it was all devoted to not changing what students thought, but how they thought. Right?
Well,
Not what activism they were engaged in, but how they engaged in their activism. And it really had profound effects.
Jane, I also just want to throw one other piece in here about the college
please.
environment, which I think is really important. What Jeff alluded to before was a distinction that I drew between what makes students unsafe, what is unproductively uncomfortable, and what is productively uncomfortable. We want our students to grow up in environments that are productively uncomfortable. The problem is right now the Jewish community is responding to all three of those as the same threat. And if you respond to things that you want with the same tools of things that you're trying to suppress, you're going to really create a lot of problems. And I think that's a little bit what's happening now, legitimately because of all of the fear about what's going on campus. However, there is a little bit of actually, I would say a pretty significant misrepresentation about what's going on campus, in part because the stories of violence, which are significant, and the stories of anti-Semitism, whether it's the violent version or the uncomfortable version, are significant and inflammatory. But meanwhile, Hillel directors around the country are reporting that they have never had more attendance and participation in Jewish life on campus than since October 7th. What never will get into Jewish media, much less mainstream media, is student mobilization in support of one another, student participation in Jewish life in support of one another. It's already the case that, forget about the campus, mainstream media is very drawn to stories about political dissident behavior in the Jewish community. So 300 people trying to shut down Port Authority gets more press than 10,000 people in a pro-Israel rally outside the UN. The numbers are simply not there. It's just an exciting story. People love that version of the story. So I just really think it's important, especially as a Jewish community tries to respond to the perceived crisis on campus, that it also views this as a moment of really powerful opportunity. I think as many, if not many more Jews who feel that October 7th was a turning point in terms of deciding to stand up in a more anti-Israel way. I know these are not ideal terms. There's also a kind of groundswell of a return to Jewish life post-October 7th. And I think the numbers are more on that side of things. And I'm nervous that we're going to spend most of our time worrying about the small percentage of people who are angry and out, more than the vast majority who are now curious and in.
Thank you. In just a few moments, we're going to turn to some questions from you, the audience. But I also just sort of want to pick up on what you said, Yehuda, to say this. This conversation has mostly been about American Jews and liberal Judaism here, although you've certainly alluded, Michelle, to the beauty of a global Judaism. But you, Yehuda, have spent so much work also bringing American Jewish leaders and educators to Israel to learn, but also to be in dialogue with Israelis, with Muslims there. Is the challenge different now after October 7th? And how would you want us to meet it?
Yeah, there's so many pieces of that. I'll just give you one angle on this. I think
Mhm.
I think we're in for a hard ride at post October 7th for interfaith and intergroup work between Jews and our allies here in America. I think there's already been a little bit of a reckoning. A lot of Jews wondering why their allies didn't show up in support of them post October 7th. And what's especially confusing is that those allies did show up after the Tree of Life shooting. So it's
Mhm.
not that people don't show up for Jewish
Mhm.
tragedies, it's they don't show up for Israeli Jewish tragedies, which means they don't really get a piece of our identities, which is tied into this idea that Jeff talked about of Jewish peoplehood. So there's something has ruptured here. And certainly the polarization around Israel-Palestine on the left has created profound tensions. It's a bigger pro-Palestinian activism is a bigger pillar of left activism in this country than many Jews left of center have wanted to really wrestle with. So I think we're in for a very hard ride here. In Israel, ironically, Palestinian citizens of Israel after October 7th, or 20% of the population, post October 7th, this is extraordinary, are now, based on every population study, are exhibiting a greater loyalty to Israeliness than they ever have. There's a bunch of reasons for that. They were victimized on October 7th, and they are desperate for and rightly so, that Israelis and others parse the distinction correctly between being Palestinian and being Hamas. Um, Now, there's a lot of discrimination going on in Israeli society against Palestinians who are citizens of Israel who are not members of Hamas, and there's terrible crackdowns. But that is a community that is signaling we are really eager to actually be good, law-abiding, tax-paying citizens of this country. And as a result, I could tell you, like, our work at Hartman is in a holding period domestically on interfaith and intergroup work. It's going to be just very hard to do anything right now in the middle of a war. But in Israel, our interfaith and intergroup work between Israeli Jews and Israeli Palestinians is full systems go, because there's a
Hmm.
window of opportunity right now to actually say, we know there's a war between Israel and Hamas, but it is not a war between Israel and the Palestinians, and it can't be. And it is definitely not a war, as some people want it to be, between Jews and Muslims or between the West and Muslims. So in order to resist that, the agenda around interfaith and intergroup work is actually more important ever right now in Israel. And maybe for us as American Jews, our piece of that work can wait a little bit longer.
Hmm. Do you think, though, that that message, that there is this receptivity in Israel, can translate here?
I would hope so, but one of the things that we've seen over the years is that, and it kind of makes sense logically, proxy warriors for a cause 7,000 miles away are oftentimes far more militant and less nuanced than the actual warriors in the conflict, as crazy as that is. You
Yeah.
see it, like, one of the ways that's been a source of tremendous frustration to me here as an American Jew is that the spectrum of views that you're allowed to hold as an American Jew about Israel is narrower than those held by Israelis.
Oh, yeah.
That doesn't make any sense. I mean, if to be pro-Israel should really be to be pro-Israeli. And it's not true. It's only pro a certain narrow viewpoint. So that tells us that maybe the American Jewish community, and in some ways the American Muslim communities, are not monoliths, of course, but those communities are stuck in patterns of proxy battles that are just making it really hard for certainly our institutions to do any serious interfaith work right now. And it's even, spilling down to individuals.
That's very interesting. So we have some questions from this wonderful audience, and a number of them seem to be asking, what now? What are the next steps? You've outlined to some degree the problem and the challenges. What, for example, should Jewish leaders do? Are there even some very quick and shorter term steps that can signal how the community can pivot to this new world, to reacting to this new world?
I'll take that for a second. I think number one, a greater attention to unity among American Jews. One of the things that I've often believed is that certainly in liberal Jewish institutions, as Yehuda said, since those institutions really are quite troubled, there needs to be much more synergy, much more cooperation, and I dare say, I predict within 25 to 30 years, there will be merger. I actually advocate for a merger between Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion, and the Jewish Theological Seminary.
So let's just explain for those who don't know that you're talking
Reform
about
Seminary, the Reform Seminary and the Conservative Seminary.
Conservative.
Let's start with them. I don't want to leave out the Reconstructionists, but let's just start with who we are, because I think we're really reaching the same Jews. And I think that once we get involved in a higher intellectual form of Jewish education and academic research, the differences are, well, they're the narcissism of small differences. I'm saying, of course, Jewish law and commitment to Jewish law is important, but in the long run, I think we should all be studying together. So I think there's going to have to be a kind of a whittling down of resources and certainly bricks and mortar. I also think, as I've said, education for Jewish peoplehood, but I'll also go one step further. I write in the book about Paul Simon, about Bob Dylan, about Leonard Cohen, about Steven Spielberg. I hear people talking about being culturally Jewish. I'm saying to them, well, this is our culture. I think we need to actually seek out much more Jews who are the practitioners of popular culture, and in some ways try to invest them with the investment, as it were, in our community and to create a more robust American Judaism. I really believe that one of the great laws of Jewish history is that after every catastrophe, there was a period of creativity, whether it was the Babylonian exile that gave birth to the creation of the Torah, whether it was the destruction of Judean independence by the Romans, which gave birth to Rabbinic Judaism, whether it was the expulsion of the Jews from Spain, which gave birth to a certain kind of Jewish mysticism, whether it was the massacres in the Ukraine in the 1600s that ultimately gave birth to Hasidism. You know, there's a great Hasidic proverb that says, if you're looking for a spark, you have to go through the ashes. And I think that if my historical lens is clear and correct, and especially after 1967, after the Six-Day War, which was quite different from this moment, I think we have every reason to believe that we could be on the cusp of an American Jewish Renaissance. Now, there's a very big if here. If our institutions manage it correctly. That's a very big.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So how do they manage it correctly? Do either of you, Michelle, Yehuda, have some quick ideas?
I'm retired.
I mean, I'll propose some quick ideas just since I'm in the field, and then Yehuda will also just enlighten us in general. But I would say three things. One, more Shabbat. Like, in whatever way you do Shabbat, like, make it more. If as community, make it deeper, make it richer, invest in dinners and in lunches. People come. If you feed them, they will come. If you make it joyful and musical, they will come. At Kane Street, we are certainly seeing, and of course I am in Brooklyn, right? So there is bounty here of Jews. But we are growing, and we are growing on Shabbatot, and it is warm, and it is rich, and it is joyful, and it is fun. So I would say more Shabbat, more Shabbat. I'd also say more facilitated conversations. So more opportunities to really be together in ways that also probe deeply. So I would say, and this is my community organizing training coming in. I think lots of, whether it's parlor meetings or listening campaigns, lots of either group facilitated conversations, one-on-ones where people are really digging in, again, across difference to really know each other. And fine, I'll say maybe one more thing, and then the chesed work is profound. The work that we've
explain what chesed work is.
Well, so chesed is loving kindness, and community care is another way to say it. There's nothing that stitches a community more deeply together than celebrating one another and comforting and holding one another, raising each other up, right? To quote the Mishnah that actually Jeff talks about in his book. So the Gemara actually, but so I would say chesed work, Shabbat, and facilitated conversations to get to know each other. And then finally, more both and, right? More willingness to hold, you talked about how Hillel's statements need to be uttered simultaneously, Jeff, for sure, right? You said, what's now? Let's go back to his statements. So if not now, when? Right, is his last thing. If I'm not for myself, who will be for me? If I'm only for myself, or when, really, it says when I'm only for myself. The idea being inevitably, sometimes I'm going to only be for myself. And then what do you do when that happens, right? You really turn and look at yourself and demand that we hold both, and demand that our communities do, that we shouldn't give up on either Jewish safety or justice. And it's hard, and we're going to be leaning in more to one or the other, but demand them both. Yeah.
Well, thank you. Yehuda, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think look, I think Jeff and Michelle represented the kind of twin ends of what could change and needs to change, and maybe there's a window of opportunity for this to happen. Jeff, you leaned on the institutional side. I think there is a historic moment that we're in right now because of the crashing that's happened around American Jewish institutional life and ideological life and all the changes in Jewish identity in the past couple of decades. October 7th feels to me like a coda of a lot of those changes. And there's an institutional window of opportunity. I think folks who I speak to in Jewish institutional philanthropy, who are the only people who could actually dramatically change the landscape, they see it as a window of opportunity. COVID was one window of opportunity, and some changes started to get made of where would you see the next great big bet of hundreds of millions of dollars of Jewish philanthropy to radically re-engineer Jewish education. I feel closer now in my career professionally to seeing that happen than ever before. You needed some wake-up calls. And Michelle, I think you took the flip side of it, which is it's fine to structurally remake, Jewish education, tear down this institution, merge these two together. But if you don't have like a Torah in it, if you don't have a set of commitments and values that are ultimately going to reflect something timeless and timely, then all you're doing is, reshuffling the deck chairs in the Titanic. So you're giving us like a set of values, right? That would help if you were going to do what Jeff is proposing of merge the two main non-Orthodox rabbinical seminaries in America, and then use the $1 billion of real estate you have to build something extraordinary. You can't simply say and then go back and teach the same dated version of American Judaism. That doesn't work. So I think, Michelle, you're inviting us to pick up like what is the best stuff of Judaism. What's the stuff that just works the best? What is the core messages that, Daniel Hartman likes to say that like religions crowdsource the best stuff over time.
Mm-hmm.
Just why like all the main religions talk about like kindness, and only Judaism talks about like weaving flax and linen together in the same garment, and not that many people care about that anymore. And it's partly because it's like a good indicator. A few billion people know that godliness is probably more importantly routed through kindness than it is through those, through those kind of minutia. It doesn't mean a life of observance doesn't matter, but it means that we have to focus on what are the big plot points of what we're gonna invest in to make a robust, compelling Judaism that people are going to want to opt into.
Well, thank you. That seems like a really poignant and inspiring place to conclude this discussion. I know that we could talk for hours more, but I thank you so much for sharing your insights and your willingness to listen to each other, sometimes not always directly agreeing, but that's part of it as well. I do want to remind the audience that there is a recording of this that will be made public soon. And of course, to dive deeper into the thoughts and ideas that we have expressed this afternoon, to buy your own copy of Tikun Ha'am, Repairing Our People by Rabbi Jeff Salkin, whom we thank so much, Rabbi Michelle Dardashti, Dr. Yehuda Kurtzer, and to the Religion News Service for hosting this most illuminating afternoon. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.